Russia never would have invaded Ukraine if it wasn't for the threat of NATO expansion. We've heard this a lot, and in this video, I'm going to break down why these trolls might be correct. So prior to February 24th, 2022, I actually would have sided with a lot of the pro-Russian commenters saying, yeah, it's unfair that we're going to have military bases on the border of Russia. Who would want that? The U.S. wouldn't want that. Other countries wouldn't want that. We need to stop NATO expansion. Ukraine shouldn't even have these talks with NATO. They shouldn't even think about it. Not that it was going to happen anytime soon, because anytime you have a disputed territory or you have an ongoing war like the one in Donetsk that Russia started in 2014, you can't even join NATO anyways. But the fact is, NATO has expanded, but because of Russia. Let's talk about that.
NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in the aftermath of the Second World War to maintain peace and freedom and prevent conflict.
First off, a lot of people don't understand that NATO is a defensive alliance, and that started because of Soviet aggression. People don't want to have wars. Rich countries, the wealthy countries, want stability. And this is why Sweden and Finland never wanted to join NATO, never even thought about joining NATO until they realized, hey, Russia is still invading their neighbors, and if we don't join, Russia might invade us one day. We all thought that these wars of aggression and land grabs were over. There's enough resources, there's enough food, there's enough everything nowadays in 2022, 2024, not to have to start a war and steal more land.
Russia, the largest country by land area, has a population of 146 million people. The country's gross national income in 2020 was $10,690 per capita. Russia exported goods worth $337 billion. Mineral fuels, including oil, accounted for 42% of exports. In 2020, Russia exported $72 billion worth of crude oil and $45 billion worth of processed petroleum oils.
But turns out that Russia still has these imperial ambitions of having the great Russian Empire, the USSR, to have all these territories back. And Russia and Putin decided to invade Ukraine before Ukraine was able to join NATO because they knew that they wouldn't be able to after.
Принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation, in his words, to demilitarize Ukraine. That Russia would bring in troops. He told Ukrainian troops to lay down arms and go home. Putin warned outside countries not to interfere. A Russian military operation, it would appear.
So all the people who comment saying Russia invaded Ukraine because of NATO expansion, you guys are correct. Because if Ukraine was part of a defensive alliance, Russia never would have been dared. They never would have dared to step foot in there because they knew that all the other partners would put their soldiers on the ground to protect. NATO does not start wars. They defend and finish them. Now, all the Serbians commenting right now are saying, oh, well, NATO bombed our country.
Yes, Ukraine is going through a tough time, but it's not the first European war since 1945. That leader was Alexander Vučić. He is the president of Serbia.
Many say that this was the first conflict on the European soil after the World War II. But the truth that the territorial integrity of a country in Europe, Serbia, as a matter of fact, which did not attack any other sovereign country, was violated, is constantly unspoken.
Which war is he talking about? You won't see many memorials about it, nor will you hear calls for accountability, because this war was waged by NATO and the victim was Serbia, or as it was called then, Yugoslavia. In 1999, NATO bombed the country into the Stone Age. Soldiers, civilians and children were all killed. In one blow, NATO broke a country apart. On March 24th, the airstrikes began. They continued for almost 3 months, 78 days to be precise. It was called Operation Allied Force. NATO pilots flew 38,000 sorties. Out of them, more than 10,000 were for airstrikes. The brutality is in the numbers.
What they always leave out is that Serbia was killing people in Kosovo and Bosnia for almost a decade before that. NATO finally stepped in and said, you know what, enough is enough, we need to stop this.
President Bill Clinton and NATO eventually decided to intervene militarily to end the bloodshed and to prevent Yugoslav forces from conducting the mass expulsion of Albanians from Kosovo.
Today, we and our 18 NATO allies agreed to do what we said we would do, what we must do to restore the peace. Our mission is clear: to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's purpose so that the Serbian leaders understand the imperative of reversing course, to deter an even bloodier offensive against innocent civilians in Kosovo, and if necessary, to seriously damage the Serbian military's capacity to harm the people of Kosovo. In short, if President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
In March 1999, NATO began a bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, with 1,000 aircraft flying from bases in Italy or aircraft carriers in the Adriatic Sea, plus, of course, cruise missile strikes from submarines.
Whether NATO should have been involved, that's a whole different subject. Personally, I think that if NATO didn't get involved, it would be much easier to justify NATO's existence and say, you know what, they're not part of our alliance, we don't need to step in, we don't care if it's the right thing to do, we don't care if Serbia is killing all these Bosnians, killing all these Muslims, killing all these people in Kosovo, that has nothing to do with us, we're going to stay clear. Now, I'm sure if you're from Kosovo, you'll be like, thank God that NATO stepped in, it was the right thing to do. So that's a completely separate subject.
When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And according to the Wilson Center, the newly formed government used the stockpile as leverage to get security guarantees from Russia that it would not attack them in exchange for denuclearizing. The US and the UK gave assurances to Ukraine that they would provide aid if an attack ever happened. But all four countries agreed to consult each other if the treaty's commitments ever came into question. So it's true, Ukraine did agree to give up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange for safety from a US or Russian invasion. And that's why international leaders say Russia violated the agreement by invading Ukraine last month.
In the year 1994, Uncle Sam came knocking at my door. Come to Budapest and give up your weapons. We got you covered in case anything happens fast.
Ukraine had a pact with the West, and actually with Russia, that if they gave up voluntarily their nuclear weapons, the US and Russia would protect Ukraine if anyone would to try to attack them. Unfortunately, that was only a handshake agreement that isn't an official part of a treaty like NATO. And when one of those two partners, Russia, decided to attack, this is when the US said, you know what? We're going to support freedom and we're going to support democracy and we're going to support Ukraine and allow them to defend themselves, but we're not going to send in NATO troops on the ground. Any Russians who say they're fighting NATO, you're not. There is no NATO soldiers in Ukraine. I live here. I'm actually here in the heat with my windows closed in the dark because Russia just bombed our electrical grids, our civilian electrical grids, about a week ago, and we have no power this whole week.
Air raid sirens over Kyiv as the largest Russian air attack in months is detected. Russian missiles struck power plants in cities across the country. Seen here striking Lutsk in the west and Dnipro in the east.
This is the worst aerial assault Ukraine's had to endure in months, with the express purpose of trying to smash Ukraine's electricity and water networks.
Literally, we have 1 or 2 hours a day of electricity. There's a generator outside, which is loud, which is why the windows are closed. The camera's by the window. There's the only way I can get enough light to film this. Everything's run off a battery. And this has nothing to do with, NATO expansion. Ukraine wants to join NATO, and Ukraine needs to join NATO to protect itself, so Russia could not attack again. And it's so important for Russia not to be able to attack and win, because it just encourages other dictators to do the same thing. I guarantee if the West didn't step in to help Ukraine defend itself, China would have looked at Taiwan and said, oh, you know what? I don't think the US is really going to defend Taiwan if we step in. That would have been next. And who knows what other wars would have been started. Maybe North Korea would have stepped into South Korea. Either way, there would have been wars spreading out all over the place. And we cannot have that in a free society where we want peace. And we want stability more than anything. If you look at it just financially, yeah, of course the US makes money from manufacturing more weapons and having this war happen. So all the people who had these conspiracy theories saying, oh, it's the military industrial complex, it's Vanguard, it's BlackRock, it's the whatever. They're always going to find a way to make money off of something. But the fact is, Russia started this conflict, Russia started this war, Russia started this invasion, not the other way around.
Vladimir Putin disputes whether a border between Russia and Ukraine should exist.
Мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ.
He says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and has claimed that Ukraine isn't a state, but Ukraine is proud of its independence.
Ми молода країна з тисячолітньою історією.
As far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine must never join NATO. And for Ukraine's first years of independence, that didn't seem likely. Ukraine was led by governments friendly to Moscow. But by Ukraine's 2004 presidential elections, it was clear Ukrainians had begun to look westwards, and Russia's influence had its limits. With the help of mass protests, Putin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych lost to pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. It became known as the Orange Revolution, and was evidence that Russia was losing control of Ukraine. For as long as Putin's political woes continue, Russia's border with Ukraine is unlikely to be left in peace.
Russia started the war in Ukraine because they knew that if they didn't do it now, it would be harder to do in the future, especially if Ukraine joined a strategic defensive alliance. And that is a key word. Ukraine just wants to defend themselves.
Please give the Ukrainians defensive weapons with which to defend themselves. It is insane.
Now, you say that we have to arm the Ukrainians. The Obama administration, of course, has been hesitant to do that. Why do you think that economic sanctions won't be enough?
Well, Vladimir Putin right now has 40,000 troops on the border. He is obviously causing disturbance in eastern Ukraine. It is clear that he is fishing in troubled waters. So why not say to Vladimir Putin, we are going to give these people a means to defend themselves, and then maybe that might alter his calculations. If you look at it from his standpoint, it's pretty clear that there has been no penalty to pay for what he has already done.
Russia propagandists and BS says if the U.S. sends Ukraine weapons, if the U.S. trains Ukrainian soldiers, if Ukraine is supported somehow by the West, then we should attack them. But it's complete BS. The exact same thing is happening in Taiwan right now. Taiwan is begging the U.S. for defensive weapons and for military training so they can defend themselves. China has said many times, if the U.S. helps Taiwan, we will invade Taiwan. And luckily, Taiwan has called their bluff, and the U.S. has called their bluff and said, you know what? If Taiwan, a sovereign nation with its own people, who does not want anything to do with mainland China, who who has their own separate government, their own separate currency, separate people, separate culture. If they want to defend themselves, we're going to allow them to defend themselves.
The Taiwan issue is purely China's internal affair, which won't stand for any foreign interference. Issues bearing on China's core interests, including the sovereignty and territorial integrity, there is no room for compromise or concession.
In downtown Taipei, pomp and circumstance. Dancing. And an F-16 flyby to tell Beijing, back off.
I want to call on China to cease their political and military intimidation against Taiwan and ensure the world is free from the fear of war.
Lai Ching-te, known as William Lai, is the 8th democratically elected president of Taiwan, known formally as the Republic of China. His inauguration message, Taiwanese democracy is here to stay.
I hope that China will face the reality of the Republic of China's existence and engage in cooperation with the legal government chosen by Taiwan's people.
But Beijing is in no mood to cooperate and says the only legal government of Taiwan is the Communist People's Republic of China.
如果有人胆敢把台湾分裂出去，我们一定会不惜一战，不惜代价，一定会打到底。这是中国不二的选择。
And the same thing has happened in Ukraine since 2014. Ukraine just wants to be independent. They want to separate themselves from Russia. And whether or not that is, culturally the best thing to do or not, that's a whole separate discussion. But the fact is, if Ukraine wants to protect themselves, that's their God-given right. As a sovereign country, that is their right to protect themselves, and they should seek help from the biggest military, the strongest military in the world. They should seek help to buy weapons, defensive weapons, from the US and to ask for training from the US. And that is why the US is involved. That's why these NATO countries are involved, because Russia is an aggressor. Ukraine just happens to live next to a country that thinks that they should be able to take over whenever they want. So at the end of the day, yes, if Ukraine never desired to join NATO, maybe Russia never would have attacked. But at the same time, Ukraine would just be a vassal state like in Belarus. And Ukrainians don't want that. And it's up to them to be able to decide their own.
European Union leaders and Ukraine have failed to sign an historic free trade deal after a last-minute U-turn from Kiev.
Вы сказали, вроде бы как бы работали в этом направлении.
Мы тут, щоб довести, що Україна – це дійсно Європа.
Майдан – це голос народу. Голос народу – це голос Божий.
So next time you read a comment where someone says Russia only attacked Ukraine because of the threat of NATO expansion, you could say, you know what, you're right, because they knew that once they joined NATO, Russia wouldn't be able to attack them. It's that simple. And by the way, Finland and Sweden never would have actually joined NATO if Russia wasn't attacking their neighbors. Finland and Sweden both did not want to join NATO. They needed to join NATO. And they actually did join NATO. And guess what? Russia hasn't done anything. Russia didn't say, I'm going to attack Finland and Sweden because they applied to join NATO. They had a window where they could have attacked Sweden or Finland. But Putin was like, no, that's not a big deal. We don't care about them. So the whole argument of NATO expansion being the reason why Russia attacked Ukraine is irrelevant, because Finland shares a border with Russia as well. And I understand most people, they're commenting these troll comments never learned geography, never looked at a map, but take a look on screen right now. Finland has a massive border with Russia. And if Russia did not want a NATO country being on their border, they would have attacked Finland and stopped them from joining NATO. But that didn't happen because that was never the real reason. Russia just wanted Ukraine back, and they knew that they had to try to take it back before Ukraine was strong enough to defend themselves or strong enough to become a defensive alliance, be part of a defensive alliance. And that is the truth. From someone who actually lives in Ukraine, who wanted nothing to do with politics or to understand war, but being here for almost 3 years during war, I've been forced to learn a lot, and I hope you guys have as well. Please share this with a friend, or next time someone mentions this as an excuse, one of the many excuses of why Russia has attacked Ukraine, because it's complete BS. Thank you guys.